was around 8 years old at this time. I lived in a pretty old house in a pretty populated area. We have a couple of trees outside the front of the house, so people walking by couldn't see in through the window. It was around 9 PM and we were expecting friends over for dinner. Yes, I know, it was pretty late to have dinner, but they were running late due to a traffic jam. Anyway, my parents forgot something when cooking dinner and had to run down to the store and buy some more stuff. They left me at home by myself and I just wanted to stay in my bedroom playing the PlayStation. During a quiet moment in the game, I heard some rustling in the trees outside the front of my house. I opened the curtains to look outside and I saw someone. It was pretty dark at the time, so I could barely make them out, but they were standing next to the tree in the front of my yard, just staring at me. I did something extremely stupid and just brushed it off and went back to my game. I heard another noise, so I checked outside again, and there he was, but a little closer this time. He was standing on the steps to the front porch, but this time I could make him out. He was a tall man, around 6'5", and he had a black hoodie on, and he just stood there and he was staring at me. I didn't think to call the police, since I was young and stupid, but I did make sure to grab a knife. When I got back to the window and looked outside, he was right outside my window, staring down at me, eyes wide open with a terrifying smile that still scares me to this day. I did something rather stupid again, and I yelled out, "Go away, I have a knife." Then his smile was gone. He looked absolutely furious. I closed the curtains to my window and ran to the living room to hide behind the couch. I could hear loud banging noises from the front door, as if somebody was trying to break into the house. The sounds went on for about 3 minutes and I was absolutely terrified. It sounded as though he was literally trying to kick down the front door, until I heard a car coming down the road. The noises stopped. He must have ran away. Then a car pulled up in my driveway, and it was my parents. I immediately told them what had happened, and they just brushed it off as it was my imagination. Ever since that day, I never stayed at home alone again. I grew up in a small house with just my mother. It was a nice little house, 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small living room and a kitchen on the main floor, and a basement where I kept all of my toys. This basement had a small storage room in the back, lit by one single bulb. It wasn't until I was about 7 years old that I started to get scared down there. It was a dark rainy night and I was playing with my Lego in the basement. The rainwater slowly dripped through the window and down the wall, and it was freezing down there that night, more so than usual. I was wrapped up in a hoodie and my blanket while attempted to build an aeroplane out of my Lego. Then, suddenly, I got a chill down my spine, followed by the overwhelming feeling of being watched. I turned and looked behind me towards the dark storage room. Something drew my attention to the room, but I couldn't see what it was. It seemed darker than usual, and I didn't think a room could get that dark, especially with the lights on in the room adjacent to it. It almost seemed like there was something in there, drawing away all of the light, sucking it into a black hole. I stared into the darkness at seamlessly nothing, until I saw something move. I didn't know what it was, but it seemed even darker than the room. This terrified me, so I ran upstairs to the living room to seek some comfort from my mother. When I told her what I had seen, she just told me that it was in my mind, and it was my mind playing tricks on me. I went to bed that night, not thinking much about what had happened in the basement. I laid back on my bed and closed my eyes, and fell asleep rather quickly. Although I fell asleep like it was a normal night, the night was less than normal. I woke up with the feeling I was being watched. I opened my eyes to see nothing but darkness. I couldn't even see the light from the street light outside of my window. Thinking that maybe my blinds were closed, I looked across my room for the soft green glow of my alarm clock, but it wasn't there. I realised that this was a lot like the darkness that I had seen in the basement, and that scared the hell out of me. My fear doubled in an instant when I thought I saw movement from the darkness. In my terror from seeing that there was something in my room, I pulled my blankets over my head and I screamed. While I was screaming, I heard my door open and a soft call from my mother as she came and sat down on my bed. I slowly pulled the blankets from over my head and looked around my room. The green light had returned to my room and I could see the soft glow of my alarm clock blinking at 2:17 a.m. And the light from the street light was outside my window with my fully open blinds. My mother asked me what was wrong and I told her what had happened. Reassuringly, she told me that it was nothing and it was probably just a nightmare and to go back to sleep. She gently kissed me on the forehead and left my room, closing the door behind her. It was hard for me to fall back to sleep after that, so I just watched my clock slowly tick away the minutes. This went on for about 2 or 3 months, staying at this level of activity. Nothing more than the feeling of being watched in the darkness. However, that all changed on Halloween night. It was a typical scary Halloween night, cold, windy and rainy. I had returned home that night with my mum from trick-or-treating at about 8 o'clock and went down to the basement to play with my toys for a bit before I went to bed. I could hear the rain tap against the basement window and the wind whistling as it blew between my house and my neighbour's house. Something was unsettling in the basement that night, more so than usual. As I played, I thought I heard sounds coming from the storage room, but every time I looked round, there was nothing. This was nothing strange to me, as it's been happening for the last few months, so I continued to play. I played on for about 10 more minutes when the power suddenly went out, and that was when everything changed. As soon as the power went out, I heard more movement from the storage room behind me. I immediately looked behind me to see a quick flash of red light, and then darkness. As I stared, I could hear footsteps from the dark room, but I could see nothing. The footsteps slowly made their way towards me, the darkness somehow getting darker as they approached, until they suddenly stopped. I moved my eyes around the room, careful not to move any other part of my body in the fear that whatever this was would see me. I looked around the room trying to see what this thing was, but I could see nothing. It was too dark, I couldn't even see my feet. I wanted to run upstairs to the safety of my mother, but I was frozen in fear, so I didn't move a muscle or even breathe. I sat in silence listening for whatever was in the room with me. I couldn't hear a sound, not even the rain on the window or even the wind between the houses. As I listened, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up on edge, and I got chills running down my spine, and that's when I heard it. A deep voice whispered into my right ear, "You will be mine, Robert." I instantly screamed and ran back up the stairs, tripping over my toys along the way. I made my way back up the stairs and through the door to the living room, slamming the door behind me. I ran to my mother, crying, and she held me, not knowing what was going on. I told her what had happened, but she just told me it was my mind playing tricks on me again, and what I heard was just the wind. From that moment in the basement, no matter what my mother said, I knew whatever was going on, it was real. From then on, I refused to go back into the basement alone. In fact, I didn't like going into the basement at all. The activity in the basement itself settled down a bit because I refused to ever be alone down there, but I still had trouble sleeping. I would wake up at night with the feeling of being watched to see nothing in my room but darkness. I would lay there staring into the darkness with the blankets pulled up to my neck, hoping there was nothing there, but after a few minutes I would hear the same voice again, "You're mine, Robert." The second I would hear that voice, I would pull my blankets over my head and scream, causing my mother to run into the room, and every time she would just say it was a bad dream. This sequence would go on at least twice per week until August of 1998, when the activity escalated yet again. My mother had been dating her now husband for a while, and we were preparing to move into his house. I was going to be going on holiday to Dubai for 2 weeks with my grandparents, as my mother moved our things out of the house, but what happened on my final night in that house still terrifies me to this day. I had fallen asleep easily that night, excited to be leaving on vacation the next morning, but the rest of the night would not be so easy. I woke up again that night, this time to the sound of breathing. I opened my eyes to see nothing but darkness yet again. Thinking that my mother was in the room with me, I called out to her, "Mum?" But what answered was definitely not my mother. It was that deep voice yet again. Your mother is not here. She can't help you, Robert. You're finally mine. I continued to stare into the darkness, thinking it was all my imagination. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see the silhouette of a dark figure standing at the end of my bed. I immediately pulled the blankets over my head and screamed, but my mother didn't come. I felt the pressure at the end of my bed as if somebody was sitting down at the bottom of it. I screamed again. Suddenly, I felt something grab onto my ankles under the blanket and pull. I somehow managed to turn onto my stomach and grab the end of my mattress. But it only gave me a few seconds before it shifted and I was pulled right out of my bed. I continued to scream, louder than I have ever screamed before. Finally, I could hear my mother get out of her bed and start making her way towards my door. Only this time, when she reached it, the door did not open. Whatever it was continued to drag me towards the door as I continued to scream. I could hear my mother pushing against the door trying to get it open without success. As it dragged me across the carpet, I finally managed to grab the foot of my bed and take hold, but then I could feel it dragging harder. It was trying to get me through the door. It was pulling me so hard that it pulled my body off the carpet, but I managed to hold on. As I fought the entity, I could hear my mother struggle with the door. It took my mother a good 2 or 3 minutes to try and get the door open. As the door finally opened, light returned back in my room, and I no longer felt the grip on my ankles, and I fell back to the carpet. I looked around the room, terrified. My room was a disaster. The sheets were in a ball on the floor, my mattress was halfway off the bed frame, and my bed was no longer sitting flush with the wall. I looked around for the entity, but it was no longer there. My mother held me tight as I cried on the floor, not knowing what had happened, only thinking that it was a really intense nightmare. I spent the rest of that night in my mother's bed, but did not sleep. The next morning, I could see the rug burns on my arms and my elbows from being dragged across the carpet. I looked at my ankles to see that they were red and swollen, but harder to see were the little scratches along the top of my feet. That was my last night in that house, and I'm glad it was. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted from me, but it still scares me to this day, and I'm in my 20s now. I just pray that whatever it was, it doesn't come after me again.